The fundamental thing about the ocean is that it is overwhelmingly important to life on planet Earth. The ocean is incredibly important to the processes that keep the planet habitable. As Sylvia Earle has also said, there's no green without blue, and essentially the ocean is the beating heart of planet Earth, and we need to keep it healthy.
Hello and welcome back to the State of the Earth podcast. I'm your host, Sofia Salas Lopez, and I'm joined today by a very exciting guest, Callum Roberts, a professor of marine conservation at the Centre for Ecology and Conservation at the University of Exeter's Penryn campus. He is one of the world's leading experts on coral reefs, working across both research and policy. He is currently the chief scientific advisor for several marine conservation charities, such as the Blue Marine Foundation, a charity focused on the mission of protecting 30% of the world's ocean by 2030, as well as being a WWF-UK Ambassador. Alongside this, he helped to create the series Blue Planet 2 and has written many books about the history of the marine world and the effects of anthropogenic activity on it. So, as you can see, there's a lot to get through, so let's get into it. Thank you for joining us today, Callum.
Pleasure.
I've been very excited to speak with you, so thank you for taking the time. So, just to start us off, could you explain to us a little bit about your background? I know you first studied your bachelor's in biology at the University of York, but what first inspired you to pursue conservation?
Conservation came a little bit later. I started out just being a biologist, as you say, and I studied at the University of York, and I got the opportunity there to go to the Red Sea to study coral reefs for my undergraduate research dissertation. And I fell in love with coral reefs immediately, and started to study coral reef fish distribution and behavior, and I was fascinated by their evolution and their ability to partition up all the resources on coral reefs. Coral reefs support this incredible diversity of life, and one of the burning questions at the time, and this was in the 1980s, was how do so many species coexist together in one place? And that's really what I spent my time on my PhD doing. I carried on working in Saudi Arabia and spent the next few years studying the Red Sea coral reefs and trying to figure out how coral reef fish coexisted so amicably when they're all using and competing for very similar resources on those coral reefs.
Yes, that's really fascinating.
And
Yeah.
you asked about conservation and when did conservation happen? Well, to begin with, coral reefs were in a wonderful condition. The ones that I experienced in the 1980s in the Red Sea had hardly been touched by people, and we visited some amazingly remote places. We were the first people ever to see them underwater in many of the parts of the sea that we got to. And so I was lucky enough to see coral reefs at their best. But of course, over time that has changed somewhat, and impacts have begun to accumulate. And the biggest impact, of course, is for coral reefs is climate change, and climate change has been accelerating and pushing corals beyond their ability to survive warming waters. And so you've had these mass global bleaching events where corals turn deathly white and then die. They die en masse during these global bleaching events. And there have been several of these worldwide in the last quarter of a century, and that has been pushing coral reefs further and further into a deficit, really, and corals have been in decline. And so conservation has become more and more of a burning issue for me as time has passed. And I've spent most of my career since 1990 working on marine conservation.
Yes, that's so exciting. So could you explain a little bit about why coral reefs in particular are so important globally, both ecologically but also for human communities?
Well, coral reefs are, as I mentioned, they're incredibly rich and diverse. They are the most diverse marine ecosystems on the planet, and they occupy the coastal fringe of tropical countries. They're confined largely to waters that remain above 18 degrees centigrade throughout the whole year, and so that makes them fundamentally a tropical ecosystem. And in the tropics, they both protect coasts because the corals grow up to sea level, and they provide a living rampart against wave action. So they protect coasts from storms, and they also create coasts because as a coral reef grows up, it also creates rubble as coral is broken off, and that rubble accumulates into mounds, and then it gets colonized by vegetation and it becomes an island. And some countries are made entirely of these coral islands, and the Maldives is one of those countries, sitting in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And I've been lucky enough to work there for quite some years now. And but you know, the thing about coral reefs is that their coastal protection function is at its strongest when the reef is healthy, when there's a lot of living coral. But what has happened over time is that those corals are becoming impacted by warming seas, and the warming seas is something which destabilizes the relationship, a symbiotic relationship with a seaweed that makes coral this incredible superorganism that can build reefs that can be seen from space. And so the kind of nature of that relationship is that this microscopic seaweed lives within the tissues of the living coral, and it photosynthesizes. So the corals are like a plant in some ways, and about 80 to 95% of the food of the coral comes from these little microscopic seaweeds within their tissues. And this relationship has been in place for hundreds of millions of years, and the corals have thrived as a result, and they built these huge geological formations, which you can see to the present day, but also the living reefs that surround our coasts. And that relationship is what has made corals able to extract calcium carbonate from seawater fast enough that they can lay it down into this matrix of reef and build this carbonate ecosystem, this limestone ecosystem. But the trouble with this relationship is that it goes bad when the temperature rises. So if you push a coral more than a degree or so above its typical thermal maximum, then the relationship breaks down, it becomes toxic, the coral has to get rid of the seaweed, and in getting rid of the seaweed, the coral turns this deathly white color. And if the temperatures don't come down soon enough, then the corals will die, and that is usually what happens when a coral bleaches. Some corals recover, and increasingly, as a result of repeated warming events, marine heat waves, if you like, the corals are getting tougher, and so some are now able to manage to get all the way through these heat waves without dying, and that's good news for coral reefs. And we're hopeful that that means that some of the dire predictions about what will happen to corals over the long term will not come to pass. But we're definitely seeing very dramatic changes in coral reef ecosystems as a result of climate change going on.
Yeah, no, definitely. Wow. So you touched a little bit like on this, but the Global Tipping Points report that was released in 2025 for COP30 showed that we have already reached the coral reef thermal tipping point, which you spoke about. Could you explain a bit about what that means and how alarmed should we be? How, is there a chance for this to be reversible?
Well, that's a good question. Is it reversible? And I think the answer to that on one level is no, it's not reversible, because corals are on a trajectory of change. Will there be coral 100 years from now? Yes, I think is the answer. And I may be in a minority among my colleagues for saying that. But there have been predictions that with warming of the world, that if we hit 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming above the pre-industrial average, then we'll lose 70 to 90% of our corals. If we push it above 2 degrees centigrade, we'll lose 99%. Essentially, coral reefs will be functionally extinct. And coral reefs are already, as this report suggests, being pushed over this tipping point. And what those predictions don't take into account is coral adaptation to increased temperature, and coral adaptation is happening fast. So we're seeing in the Maldives, for example, a pattern of less coral mortality at each bleaching event, despite those bleaching events being similar in their intensity and their duration. And so, I'm cautiously optimistic that corals are beginning to get to become adapted enough that they are going to survive better than predicted. That corals will remain part of the mix on coral reefs in the future, and that coral reefs will not disappear entirely, as some of these predictions suggest. And particularly given many efforts that are springing up around the world to try and grow more thermally tolerant corals. Not necessarily to genetically engineer more thermally tolerant corals, although some people are investigating that possibility, but actually to selectively breed in the way that Charles Darwin used to breed his pigeons, to produce a bigger neck ruff or more shiny wings. We're producing corals now to try and improve their ability to survive these periods of heat stress and even to thrive through them, and therefore accelerate and assist evolution taking place, so that that evolution can keep pace with the rising global temperature. Corals already exist in very stressful conditions in some parts of the world. So there are deep embayments, for example, in New Caledonia and in Palau in the Pacific Ocean, where corals experience high temperatures of the kind that will be experienced at the end of the 21st century more widely. They're already experiencing conditions of low oxygen in those same waters, and they're already experiencing uh, lowered pH. And so the corals are, they're not as rich and diverse as on reefs, normal salinity seawater and normal temperatures, but they are hanging in there. They are creating these diverse reefs, and there's every possibility that using corals from these kinds of conditions, we will be able to unlock some of the secrets to their survival and try and improve the prospects for corals into the future.
But yeah, I had actually read about the genetics of trying to make thermally adaptable coral reefs. But do you think that these sort of um, scientific interventions are they coming a bit too late? Are they taking a bit too long? Is it maybe we need to focus on addressing the bigger issues, or do you think that maybe this will help it sort of create like a time capsule in a way by taking them out of the oceans? And do you think that's feasible? What would you say?
Haha. Well, I think you're jumping forwards into several things here. One is that there are great concerns that as a result of coral mortality from heat waves and from things like disease, we are losing genetic diversity at a very rapid rate. And so one of the responses to that is, how do we stop that or store and save that genetic diversity? And that's where cryogenics comes in. And there are various billionaires who have had their bodies frozen in facilities in the hope that they could be revived hundreds of years from now. But it's less science fiction when it comes to corals, and we've developed ways of freezing corals so that they can be revived and their genetic material can be implanted, for example, into corals in the future. So we're maintaining that genetic diversity in the way that a seed bank maintains plant diversity. That, of course, is a kind of Noah's Ark approach, whereby, we get through this terrible phase of human impact on the planet and hope that there are people after who will be able to put it all back together again. It's a bit bleak and dystopian in a way. I think on the other hand, there are efforts to try and more rapidly adapt corals to the changing environment in situ. So we're looking at trying to create corals that will survive on the reef. And one of my PhD students, Rhiannon Davis, has been studying corals passing through a major heat wave in 2024 in the Maldives. And and she tracked the fates of over 10,000 colonies. And for every species that she was looking at, there were some corals that made it through this heat wave without bleaching and without apparently suffering in any sort of excessive stress. So I think it is possible that we can develop and assist um, better adapted corals that are more likely to survive through the coming decades and that are more likely to keep reefs in business during this time than our cryogenic facilities are going to. I think that's a sort of last resort, and it's a bit like, the last humans on planet Earth blasting off into space to try and find somewhere else to live with very little chance of doing so. And I think the future is a lot brighter than that, despite the obvious pressures that we're facing.
Yeah, so you would say that there is an ability for ecosystems to recover or adapt quickly enough to sort of be able to still support life in the coral reefs?
Very much so. And, a coral reef is not just about corals. Coral reefs support all sorts of other organisms. There are a huge variety of different invertebrates. There are hydroids, there are soft corals, there are sponges, there are sea fans. There's, just very great variety of life, not all of which is as thermally sensitive as corals are. And so, even if coral cover declines quite a lot, there is a lot of space for colonization and other organisms to grow and thrive. And so those reefs will still support life into the future. It's just going to be different from the way it looks at the moment. If you go to eastern Indonesia, there's a place called Raja Ampat, which is fascinating because Raja Ampat sits at the kind of interface between the Pacific Ocean on the one hand and the Indian Ocean. And the water flows from the Pacific into the Indian Ocean through all these narrow passes between islands. And that creates turbulence, which creates upwelling of colder water, which keeps the area cool through periods of heat stress. And so Raja Ampat has experienced less coral bleaching than many other parts of the world. But that sort of cooler waters has also made the reefs there fundamentally different from elsewhere. They are dominated by soft corals, not the kind of stony corals that build coral reefs. But underwater, they are incredibly rich. In fact, they're among the richest coral reefs on the planet in terms of the number of species present. So that Raja Ampat gives us this kind of vision of a different kind of coral reef that could exist in the future more widely, where you see dominance by different sets of organisms rather than the corals themselves. Of course, coral reefs grow because of coral growth and the laying down of calcium carbonate by those corals. And so, of course, reefs will, the reef growth itself may well be more affected by the loss of coral than the actual cover of invertebrate life of other kinds. And so, reefs may start eroding as they lose corals, and that's something we should worry about and try and find solutions to and try and assist the adaptation of corals so that they remain part of that living reef matrix. But it's definitely not all doom and gloom. Coral reefs have a future, and that future is not death.
That's good. That's good to hear, honestly. And yeah, and I think sometimes people, when they think of coral reefs, tend to think of only corals, but I guess it is a very complex ecosystem. But in a way, there's a lot of other issues that are also affecting them, not just the climate. And you've written a lot about overfishing and overfishing being a huge issue. So I guess, how does overfishing tie into the future of coral reefs in a way?
Well, I think overfishing is a wider problem, and around the world, we've seen fisheries being incredibly important for um, people, for their livelihoods, for nutrition and health, and just a provision of incredibly tasty food. But there's a limit to what the ocean can produce. We've often exceeded that limit, and we've exceeded it in a couple of ways. One is just taking too many fish from the sea, and the other is to take them destructively. So you use destructive fishing methods that impact the habitats that the fish need to live and thrive as you're removing them. So one kind of fishing method that has attracted a lot of attention recently is bottom trawling and dragging large fishing nets across the seabed. And as you catch the fish in these nets, so you're also catching a lot of other marine life from the bottom, all the invertebrates that live on the surface of the seabed. We're sort of churning over the mud and the sediments on the bottom and having a major impact. And so bottom trawling has now become this hugely controversial fishing method, whereby it's got its proponents, its champions who want to carry on doing as they've been doing for generations. But now we recognize and we see what kind of damage it does underwater. It just doesn't make sense anymore. And it particularly doesn't make sense in areas that are so-called protected areas. I mean, it's a remarkable fact that of the UK's marine protected areas, the majority of that space is still open to bottom trawling and dredging for scallops. And both of those fishing methods are highly destructive to marine life. And so they're totally incompatible with marine protection. No marine protected area should have any fishing going on that is like that. And in fact, the marine protected areas that work best are those that are very highly protected from any extractive use. So the ones that essentially exclude all commercial fishing and those that exclude all fishing, the highly and fully protected marine areas. Those are the ones that are doing the heavy lifting in terms of nature conservation and recovery of marine life. But establishing those protected areas doesn't mean foregoing fisheries. In fact, those protected areas help support fisheries in surrounding fishing grounds by exporting fish and exporting the offspring of fish so that they can replenish populations that are being fished. And so we can have healthy, productive seas by having networks of marine protected areas that cover extensive areas of the sea. At the moment, the world is committed to establishing 30% of the ocean as marine protected areas. We're making progress towards that, but one thing that we're not doing fast enough is increasing the amount of protection within those protected areas so that nature can properly recover and thrive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so you mentioned the 30% protected by 2030, and it has become a major international target. So how did that idea develop, and why is 30% such an important figure?
Well, I first started asking the question, how much of the sea should we protect in 1998 when less than 1%, in fact, probably less than 0.5% of the ocean was protected at that time. And so I knew for sure that the answer would not be about 1% or 0.5% of the ocean. It had to be more, but how much more? And how could we expand protected areas to the level that is necessary to allow recovery of marine life and the restoration of productive fisheries? So my research team focused on this question for a number of years and produced a series of papers over time, looking in more detail each time. And through that process, we fed the answers into international meetings like the World Parks Congress of 2003, and the each time those would sort of get embedded as recommendations. We should be protecting 20 to 30% of the sea, and then that became we should be protecting at least 30% of the sea as the science coalesced around that figure. And so it took a long time to create the science behind this. 1998, I mentioned, was when I first started looking into it scientifically. And by the time we had come up with a, really strong, credible, scientifically valid answers that were published in the peer-reviewed literature, it was 2016. And so we've been working on this for 18 years by this point. And then it took a further um, 6 years to become international policy with the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, in which target 3 is to establish 30% of land and sea as protected areas. And so, a quarter of a century in total from just thinking how much of the sea should we protect to having a global target that's adopted by countries all around the world. And we're moving in the right direction. But one thing that actually fed into a lot of that science was the assumption that those protected areas were fully protected from extractive uses. So, in other words, closed to fishing. Uh, that did not get carried over into the target. So the target doesn't say we should establish 30% of the ocean as marine protected areas and exclude fishing from those areas. But what is very clear is that we need to, if we want to bring marine life back, if we want to create a healthy, thriving ocean again. And so now we're sort of, you know, bringing to the fore the science that says that those protected areas to work need a high level of protection from extractive and damaging uses. And the reason that didn't go into the target in the Kunming Montreal biodiversity framework is because nobody would have accepted it. There would be too many countries that would say, "Hey, wait a minute, we're not going to close a third of our waters to fishing." But they were quite happy to say, "We're going to protect 30% from some things." And that, to be honest, is the way many countries' marine protected area networks are built at the moment. England, for example, has 4 huge marine protected areas that are designed solely for the purpose of protecting harbor porpoises. So they count towards England's total and push it comfortably beyond 30% of marine protected area coverage. But if you extract those ones, if you take those away from the network, then the figures come down. But what's interesting here, and again, it comes to this question of how much protection are these places given? Since those marine protected areas were given, they've been given no, as far as I'm aware, no extra protections at all, even for harbor porpoises. The government is only now going into a consultation to ask, what should we do in those areas to help harbor porpoises? And meanwhile, a report has just been published which suggests that the bycatch of harbor porpoises in UK fisheries is 1,000 per year. So you can see that they urgently need protection, but they're not getting it from these marine protected areas.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. I didn't realize that it was this whole process to, I guess, to get the policy out there. I probably think I know the answer to this one, but how close do you think we are to this target? And do you think maybe what do you think is the next step? Because 2030 is 4 years. So do you think what's the next step with this policy? What do you think will happen? Any ideas?
Well, that's a very good question. We're moving in the right direction, but not fast enough. 2030 is knocking on the door already, and we are creating protected areas too slowly to achieve the target by 2030. And to give you a sense of where we're at, if you look at the sovereign waters of coastal countries of the world, um, they extend out to 200 nautical miles offshore. So this is the space that belongs to a country, if you like. And of those waters, we have protected and globally 22% of their area. So you might think, "Hey, we're on course. This is good progress." But if you look at the distribution of that protection, it's highly skewed. So there are some places with very large exclusive economic zones that have protected a lot of it, particularly around remote oceanic islands. So England and France, or the UK and France, have large overseas territories, networks of islands that, for colonial reasons, at one time belonged to those countries, but now are affiliated with those countries. And so they've protected more of those areas than they have protected of their domestic waters. So those represent big chunks of marine space that have been protected. if you look at the median amount of the exclusive economic zones of countries of the world that has been protected, that is the amount, half of countries in the world have protected 2.6% or less of their waters. So, they are way off achieving 30 by 30, and they've got a lot of catching up to do. If you look at the high seas, that is the international waters. Now, these waters belong to all nations of the world, and they're shared international space. And those waters cover 61% of the area of the ocean, and 3/4 of the volume of the ocean. And in this part of the ocean, only 1.45% has been protected. So we are, on this trajectory that we're way off 30 by 30. And one reason for the underprotection of international waters is until now there has been no internationally agreed mechanism to create protected areas on the high seas, as they're called. But that all changed with the High Seas Treaty, which was ratified and came into force this year. And under that, it will be possible for international marine protected areas to be established. And we have to wait until the first meeting to start seeing what the process is going to look like for establishing those protected areas. But there is an enormous task, because in the high seas alone, we will need to protect more space to achieve 30 by 30 than has been protected on land and sea through all of history up to this point. So that gives
That's
you a
a lot.
sense of the challenge.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess one of the things that you mentioned was the implementation. Maybe there is like a bias, maybe it's an economic bias. Do you think this can be solved by educating on the importance of marine protected areas, or maybe explaining what some of the economic benefits could be? Do you think it's a case of educating some of the um, countries who maybe haven't been reaching this target, or maybe just some economic incentives,
Yeah,
perhaps?
I think it's all about priorities, and marine conservation has lagged behind terrestrial conservation for a long time. And one reason for that is that we can see the impacts that we're having on life on land very easily. You just have to travel to work to see the impacts that we're having on terrestrial life. We can go into the countryside and see how it's been converted to agriculture. So these are things that are very visible. By comparison, life underwater is much harder to see, and so in our imaginations, the marine environment is still less impacted and more wild, and so we feel a lower priority towards protecting it. And also, because we're fundamentally a land-based species, we also feel less responsibility towards protecting it, perhaps, and less, love of the underwater environment compared to the terrestrial one. So it is rising in priority, though, and internationally, these targets for protection of land and sea are even. What happened was that after the sort of science-based marine targets began to get talked about, the terrestrial science community, kind of piggybacked on that and started talking about 30% protection on land too. And 30% protection on land will do a lot more for wildlife than the current 18% or so, which is protected. So there's a need to expand the protected area networks further on land as well as underwater. What's interesting is that many lower income countries already are protecting a large fraction of their waters. So, for example, the island of Palau in the Western Pacific has protected nearly all of its waters from some of the most damaging human activities, and they're keeping some areas in coastal waters for artisanal fisheries for the purposes of the people of Palau, and they're keeping the big industrial fleets out of their waters to prevent the kind of harm that they do. So, it's not fundamentally an economic thing, although protected areas generally across the world, land and sea, grossly underfunded in terms of what they need to ensure that wildlife is protected properly in perpetuity.
Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, I think also you've done a lot of trying to educate, at least through your books. Your first book on the unnatural history of the sea that you published in 2008 charts the effects of 1,000 years of exploitation and fishing on ocean life. And then your other book, your Ocean of Life, How Our Seas Are Changing, again highlights how the seas have changed and how they've changed over human history. Do you think maybe that we used to think in the past that the ocean was too big for humans to affect? And how do you think that that has changed effectively? I guess obviously we know now the effects, but do you think maybe that it's only just now that we're starting to understand um, worldwide the effects of climate change and all the history of the sea?
Well, I think you're right. Throughout most of history, people thought the ocean was too big for us to have any more than local impacts. And so, that led to two fallacies. One is that we could take whatever we like from the ocean, and the other is we could put whatever we don't want into the ocean. So, with no comeback. And both of those have proven to be false. And we've taken too much from the ocean in the way of marine life, and we have added too much to the ocean in way of pollution and rubbish. And those impacts are now fully global. The marine life has been overfished throughout the ocean, and pollution has spread to every piece of the ocean, such that, when somebody takes a submersible to the deepest point of the ocean, what do they find down there? They find a Coke bottle and, remains of stuff that people have tossed over the rail of a ship as they're passing through. So our impact is everywhere, and the planet is not too big for us to impact anywhere. We are reaching the limits. We have human impacts are everywhere, and they're intensifying, and there is no escape from those impacts for anything. And that means that we now have to change the way that we relate to the planet. We have to control ourselves. We need to protect the world from ourselves, and live more sustainably. And that's a difficult transition to make. We're struggling with that. But it's the consequence of our industrialization. To give you one example, people find it very hard to understand how much heat is being added to the planet over time. And, the ocean has been the planet's air conditioner and has been absorbing the majority of the heat that is being added as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. So, roughly 90%, maybe a bit more, of the heat that is added to the planet uh, during the industrial era has been absorbed into the ocean. And that has raised ocean temperatures by about 1 degree centigrade over time. And it doesn't seem like much, and people find it easy to think that we're not having an impact on the sea or on the planet in terms of warming. And this is sort of a trivial thing. And the little, rising of the heat needle is not going to be a problem. But if you convert the heat that is being buried in the ocean into something which we can kind of get our heads around, the Hiroshima-sized atomic bomb. Many people will have seen those bombs being exploded in atolls of the Pacific where during the atmospheric testing, and so you get a sense of what goes on when an atomic bomb is exploded in the ocean. Well, the heat that is added to the ocean every day as a result of the trapping of heat by greenhouse gas emissions is equivalent to 250,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs going off in the sea. And that's just staggering. And you can't do that for very many years before you start to see the consequences in terms of far more energetic weather and major catastrophes taking place worldwide. So, that additional heat is having a very strong impact. And the rate at which heat is being added has been accelerating too. So, in recent decades, it's equivalent to more Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs than in the past, and yet that sort of addition of heat is a process that's been ongoing, and we can't escape it. That is something that we've got to address greenhouse gas emissions to bring down.
Yeah, no, that's a staggering figure. I guess maybe people don't quite realize it because you have all this media, but sometimes you have to just put it into perspective. And I guess I wanted to ask, you've had a lot of experience and you've published many books, and I was just wondering, do you think that the public is now more informed, or do you think that that's still a hurdle to passing public policy? And do you think people are more perceptive to this, or have they kind of become a bit tired of hearing it? What do you think?
Well, I think people are becoming more aware of some of the problems, but I think what has changed dramatically in the course of my career is the way that knowledge is treated. And unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen the power of disinformation on the one hand to undermine good science in people's minds, and on the other hand, we've seen also a rise in selfishness of people who just don't care. That's one response to a problem of global scale, is to say, yes, yes, it's happening. The world is warming, but it doesn't matter. We can just carry on doing what we're doing, and the hell with everything else. And I think we're seeing that selfishness becoming embedded in politics as well. And populists love to tout those kind of things. No need for you to change your lifestyle because everything will be fine. And it's this kind of technological solution to all of our problems. We've all been fine in the past, so we'll all be fine into the future. And science is telling a different story, but the scientific part of this has been sidelined to a greater extent than in the past. And I think that in the past, respect for science was very strong. I think that respect has been eroded away, nibbled away at by all of this kind of online disinformation, and by the statements of these politicians who don't really care. So I worry that we're moving in the wrong direction there. But I think on the other hand, science is uh, an undeniable truth in the end, and the truth will come and bite you in the backside eventually, and bring you to your senses. So we can see, people who are anti-vaccines being confronted with measles outbreaks and other diseases that we thought we had eradicated coming to the fore again. And the public will demand that we do something about that eventually. And unfortunately, people will suffer in the meantime. But these are scientific facts. You can ignore them if you like, but they will come and assert themselves. And in just that way, things like wildfires assert the reality of global warming. So do mass floods and hurricanes. These are things that are telling us that the planet is warming up, and that problems are building, and that we need to do something about them.
So would you say one of the solutions to this could be for more scientists to get involved in policy? What inspired you to get involved in policy?
Well, I thought that as a scientist, I look at things very critically. I look at them thoroughly, and I wanted to be able to offer an expert opinion on things. If you're going to diagnose an illness, that you really want to ask a doctor rather than just somebody you bump into on the street. And so, if scientists don't weigh in on problems of environmental, concern or origin, then non-experts will make uninformed or less informed decisions about what to do about those problems. So you really need experts to come in and offer solutions and give good advice based on good science. And there are some scientists who think that we shouldn't take part in these public debates because that somehow taints the objectivity of the science that we're doing. But actually, we've got to participate in making the scientific underpinnings of policy much stronger. And by doing that, then we look forward to better outcomes for society. And that means scientists must get involved and must offer their expertise and must do so in as objective and as credible a way as possible. But that said, we all have values, and those values do get embedded too. I mean, I speak for biodiversity. I try and put the point of view of biodiversity. I explain why biodiversity is important to people and how it fundamentally underpins the habitability of the planet. Those are things that have to be said in debates about how to protect the environment and why to protect the environment. Because some people don't understand the link. They don't understand how wildlife and open spaces and wilderness contribute to their well-being, but they do.
Yeah, no, very well said. Definitely. So would you say then that policy is one of the best ways for scientists to enact real change?
Yes, I think it is. And, policies take a long time to shift sometimes, and you have to play a long game when you're a scientist. So, I've been talking about the destructive impacts of bottom trawling on the seabed for decades. And finally, those messages are sort of beginning to move up to the decision maker level, and actively, um, you know, protection is being implemented. So in the UK, there were almost no marine protected areas closed to bottom trawling a few years ago, but now the amount of the sea that is protected, or the amount of the protected areas that are closed to bottom trawling, is increasing. And we're seeing policies now which hopefully will lead to much more of the marine protected areas being protected from this kind of industrial fishing and destructive fishing. The government has had a consultation open on this for a year today, which is a long time to wait for the results of a consultation. And that's probably because they're finding it very controversial and they're getting pushback from the fishing industry. But you know that the answer is right, that you can't protect nature without stopping bottom trawling in protected areas. So that may be an awkward truth that some government ministers don't want to grapple with, but it's like I was saying, scientific facts will assert themselves, and there's no getting away from the fact that if you run a bottom trawl across the seabed every few years, you're not going to get much recovery in between. So we need to offer nature real protection, and that is scientifically sound advice to government, and that government will have to act on it if it wants to have a credible system of nature protection in the ocean.
Yes, for sure. And I guess in a way, by scientists being more involved, it cuts through some of the time, the essential time that we need to protect and to implement policies basically to protect the sea. Now, just to move on a little bit, you something very exciting that I found was that you took part in the Blue Planet 2 documentary, which for my generation, we definitely like grew up watching it. And what was it like being a scientific advisor on this? And what do you think the role of documentaries might be in conservation?
Well, that's interesting because in the making of Blue Planet 2, I think there was a sort of push by the directors and producers of the series to confront what was really going on in the ocean to a much greater degree. Wildlife documentary making had begun to uh, get a bad reputation for looking the other way when it came to environmental impacts, and the public were being protected from seeing the consequences of environmental destruction in these nature documentaries. And so, if in one memorable sequence that I saw on the rare occasions that they did confront this, there's a cameraman in Madagascar filming an area of forest where this rare lemur occurred, and they turned the camera around, and they all around there was a deforested landscape, and so we were not seeing the deforested landscape, and the the makers of Blue Planet 2 were determined that that kind of myopia was not going to be reproduced in this series. You know, the Blue Planet 1 series had really, you know, focused on the beauty and the wonder of the ocean, and the impacts of people on the ocean were confined to a final episode in the series that wasn't even bought by the US distributor of Blue Planet One. So, you know, it was it just said that this kind of thing doesn't sell. So Blue Planet 2 was all about embedding that story within the episodes, you know, not shying away from what was going on. And that's where, as scientific advisor, you know, I could talk to the producer, the filmmakers about the best stories. I could make sure that the scientific interpretations of that were completely sound, and that they had, you know, a solid foundation of science underneath the messages that they were trying to give through the series, and it really elevated the importance and the significance of plastic pollution in the ocean, for example. The series led to far greater awareness of that, and I think a gradual sort of shift in public opinion as to what we need to do about plastics. Um, there has been for some years a global plastics treaty, which is being negotiated and undermined repeatedly by plastic producers and the oil industry that is supplying them with the raw materials. And so we're not there yet, you know, but I think that awareness has grown as a result of, you know, the series and others helping to raise public understanding of what the problems are, and get them more involved.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, it's one of my favorite documentary series. And I remember watching this during lessons in school. So it definitely created a shift for many people on how they saw it. So it's very important. And I think definitely when it comes to the media, for people to engage with the science, it needs to come from an emotional place. And that reminds me of your memoir that you published in 2020, which you published alongside an award-winning photographer, which I'd love to get my hands on it. Titled Reef Life, an Underwater Memoir. Would you be able to share a story from your time studying reefs, or just anything that you'd like to share from the book?
Well, that's a good one to spring on me. Actually, the award-winning photographer is Alex Mustard, who is an absolutely brilliant photographer. And I urge you to, you know, if you're sitting at your computer, Google Alex Mustard and immerse yourself in the wonder of his photography, because it is truly astonishing. And you know, one of the things I liked to do early in my career was to go diving on my own in the Red Sea. And in fact, it was, you know, my supervisor demanded that I go diving on my own. This is something which is completely against all the rules of health and safety these days. But you would find yourself in this incredible world that surrounds you, just beauty and wildlife and serenity. And so you could pass, you know, 2 or 3 hours underwater. Most of my dives were quite shallow because, you know, I was watching fish, I was watching how they behaved. And, you know, on one occasion, I had just been there for so long and so still in one position that there was a sudden splash in front of me, which was an osprey, you know, crashing through the surface of the water, grabbing a fish right in front of me and taking it away. And in fact, that happened twice in the Red Sea to me. And, you know, to feel that you're such a part of the environment that a bird could imagine you as the backdrop and not be scared of coming close to you. It was wonderful. And I thoroughly enjoyed experiencing that. The other interesting thing was, talking of ospreys in the northern Red Sea, on the offshore islands where there are no terrestrial predators, the ospreys would build their nests on the ground, and so they would be built up with these piles of, you know, driftwood sticks and things. But they're also made of fish bones, so you know, there are a lot of long fish that they use and they hunt, and so when they sort of take one apart, the skeleton would be incorporated into this growing platform of nest. But what's interesting is that, you know, you could see the emergence of ocean pollution in the layers of the nest, because some of these nests have been occupied for the space of, half a century or more. And you could see, sort of a third or a halfway up the nest, plastics started to get incorporated into those nests, and so they represent this sort of emergence of the Anthropocene and the spread and development of ocean pollution and our impact upon the planet. Just in the layers of an osprey nest. Fascinating.
Wow, that is so incredible. I never imagined that like you could tell just how quickly the change, the anthropogenic change has been from a bird's nest. That's so amazing. Um yeah, so I guess just to finish off, I was gonna remind you of a quote by David Attenborough. If we save the sea, we save our world. What would you say about that? Do you think that's accurate?
Totally accurate, yes. And the fundamental thing about the ocean is that it is overwhelmingly important to life on planet Earth. If you look at the third dimension of volume, it's not 71% of the world that is occupied by the sea. It is more like 97% of the volume of the biosphere, which is occupied by ocean. And because of that, the ocean is incredibly important to the processes that keep the planet habitable. With Sylvia Earle has also said, there's no green without blue, and essentially the ocean is the beating heart of planet Earth, and we need to keep it healthy.
Yeah, no, amazing. So just to give the listeners a bit of hope, what kind of initiatives or policies or work have you seen that gives you hope for the future?
Well, I think the development of the global protected area network is a source of hope. The fact that we've moved from marine protected areas being scarce, underprotected, and really a niche interest back in the 1980s to being at the forefront of global policy on planetary protection today, we are moving in the right direction. We're moving there quite fast. We're not moving fast enough, but we will get there in the end. And so I think it is promising. There is light at the end of the tunnel here.
That's great. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for speaking with me. It was all very interesting. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you on the next episode of the State of the Earth podcast.